The Haunting of the Pond, One Man's Terrifying Night. This eerie and suspenseful tale, titled The Haunting of the Pond, follows Mr. Tao, a man haunted by a malevolent spirit residing near a pond beside his garden. After several nights of strange happenings, including the mysterious loss of chickens and chilling supernatural sounds, Mr. Tao sets out to catch the thief he believes is responsible. Armed with determination and a sturdy rod, he hides in his garden to confront the culprit. However, what he encounters is far worse than a mere thief. A horrifying entity emerges from the pond, setting off a terrifying chain of events. As the spirit grows bolder, manifesting both in the form of eerie lights and chilling sounds, the tension builds to a heart-pounding climax, where Mr. Tao faces the full wrath of the vengeful spirit. The fear escalates when the spirit reveals its ghastly face and its connection to a dark past involving the pond's tragic history. With mounting dread, Mr. Tao's world unravels as he realizes that the spirit will not rest until its justice is fulfilled. As the story unfolds, readers are drawn into a world where the supernatural and the physical realms collide, leaving Mr. Tao in a terrifying battle for his sanity and his life. Part 1. Introduction to the Haunting. For days, Mr. Tao had been simmering with frustration. His chickens, the prize hens he had raised for years, were disappearing one by one in the dead of night. It made no sense. He had fortified the coop, set traps, and even bought 4 guard dogs. Yet, every morning, he would find the coop disturbingly empty, with no sign of struggle other than the occasional feather drifting on the cool morning breeze. No footprints, no noise. Just the eerie, quiet aftermath of yet another stolen chicken. Mr. Tao's once peaceful nights had turned restless. He lay awake, his mind churning with questions. Who would dare steal from him? His house was isolated, perched at the edge of the village, with his expansive garden stretching behind it. The chicken coop sat beyond the garden, near a pond that had long since dried up but left a stagnant, muddy pit in its place. That pond, which locals avoided, had a reputation, stories told in hushed whispers about strange happenings, unsettling sounds, and ghostly lights. Mr. Tao never paid much attention to superstitions. He was a practical man, grounded in the hard work of raising a family and tending to his land. But now, with this ongoing mystery, a quiet dread gnawed at him. On the surface, Mr. Tao kept his anger sharp, using it to fuel his determination to catch the thief. Whoever was sneaking onto his land would pay dearly for it. But beneath that bravado, something deeper, more sinister, was beginning to creep into his thoughts, something he couldn't quite shake. At first he thought it might be one of the village boys, someone reckless and bold enough to dodge the dogs and steal a few chickens. But the sheer cunning of the thefts made him question that theory. The chickens were disappearing without a trace, as if plucked from the earth by invisible hands. The dogs, usually alert and aggressive, had become unusually quiet at night, barely barking as the chickens vanished. It was as though they, too, sensed something amiss. Each night, Mr. Tao would sit on his porch, staring out at the dark garden beyond, the faint glow of the moon barely illuminating the rows of trees and shrubs. His thoughts would wander back to the pond, that eerie, motionless pit of muck at the edge of his property. Villagers often spoke about it being haunted about a spirit that had once lived in the water, drawn to the stillness of the place, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. They said the pond was cursed and that no one should disturb it. Mr. Tao always scoffed at such tales. Spirits weren't real. But the unease going in his chest was very real. That night, Mr. Tao made a decision. Enough was enough. He was done sitting idly by while his livelihood was stolen from him. Tonight, he would catch the thief in the act. After dinner, he told his wife and children to go to bed early. He, too, pretended to retire, slipping under the thin sheets of his bed, but keeping his eyes wide open, waiting for the sounds of the house settling into silence. Once his family was asleep, he crept out of bed, putting on his work clothes and boots. He grabbed a sturdy rod, one he had carved himself, its weight familiar in his hands. Then, he slipped out the back door, moving silently across the yard toward the coop. The night air was thick and heavy with moisture. A fog had rolled in, and the moon was only a faint smear behind a blanket of clouds. Mr. Tao moved carefully, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and a growing sense of dread he couldn't explain. He crouched behind a large shrub that gave him a clear view of the chicken coop and the garden beyond. From here, he could also see the pond just visible through the mist, its stagnant waters reflecting the faintest glimmer of moonlight. The garden was eerily quiet. Even the dogs, usually restless at this hour, were unnervingly still. Mr. Tao glanced toward the kennel, expecting to see them prowling the grounds, but they lay silently in their pens, their heads low, eyes wide, and alert as they stared into the darkness. A shiver crawled up his spine. Something was wrong. The air felt charged, as though the world were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As Mr. Tao crouched there, every muscle tense, his mind began to wander, and the stories of the pond crept back into his thoughts. He had heard them all his life, tales of a drowned man, whose body had never been recovered, of lights that flickered above the water late at night, of whispers carried on the wind. The pond, once a vital source of water for the village, had dried up years ago, but the stories remained. It had been abandoned for so long that even the children in the village avoided playing near it. Foolish stories, Mr. Tao muttered under his breath, shaking his head to dispel the unease. But as the night wore on and the fog thickened, those stories didn't seem quite so foolish anymore. Minutes ticked by, then an hour. Still nothing. The garden remained unnervingly quiet, the trees barely stirred in the still air. Mr. Tao's grip on the rod tightened. His eyes flicked between the chicken coop and the pond, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Then, just as he was about to shift positions, a sound pierced the silence, a low, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. It came from the direction of the pond. Mr. Tao's heart leapt into his throat. He squinted into the mist, trying to make out the source of the noise. At first he saw nothing, just a thick fog swirling above the water. But then something moved, a shadow, large and slow, creeping along the edge of the pond. His breath caught in his chest. It wasn't the movement of a thief or an animal. It was something else. Something that moved unnaturally, as if it were part of the fog itself. His pulse quickened, fear seeping into his bones. For the first time in his life, Mr. Tao felt truly afraid. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, and Mr. Tao realized with a jolt that it was coming toward him. He gripped the rod tighter, his palms slick with sweat, his mind racing. Should he run, stay hidden, confront whatever it was? Suddenly, the dogs began to whimper, a low, pitiful sound that sent a fresh wave of fear through Mr. Tao. They huddled together in their pens, their eyes wide with terror as they stared toward the pond, their bodies trembling. They had never behaved like this before. His heart pounded in his ears as he struggled to keep his breathing steady. Whatever was coming, it wasn't a thief. It wasn't something he could fight with a rod or scare away with a shout. Something cold and ancient was staring by the pond, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. And it was coming for him. This is the first part of the story, building tension as Mr. Tao prepares to confront what he believes is a simple thief, but quickly realizes he has stepped into something far more terrifying. The foggy, eerie atmosphere of the garden, combined with the strange behavior of the dogs and the ominous sounds coming from the pond, set the stage for the horror that is about to unfold. Mr. Tao's fear, once rooted in anger, transforms into a deeper dread as he begins to sense the supernatural forces at play. Part 2. Strange noises in the night. The night hung heavy around Mr. Tao like a shroud. As he crouched in the shadows of his garden, his breath barely audible, he strained his ears, listening for any signs of life. His eyes darted between the chicken coop and the pond, both faintly illuminated by the sickly light of the half moon hanging low in the sky. A dense fog had settled over the ground, curling like ghostly fingers through the trees, clinging to the garden, making everything feel damp and cold. The silence was so profound that it pressed against his eardrums, heightening every small sound. It was too quiet. The air was unnervingly still, as though the world was holding its breath. Not a single breezer hustled the leaves, not even the faintest chirp of a night bird or the distant croak of a frog. The usual symphony of nighttime insects had vanished, leaving behind a hollow silence that gnawed at Mr. Tao's nerves. His heart thumped loudly in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm, to focus. There had to be a rational explanation. He was here to catch a thief, not indulge in the foolish superstitions of the villagers. But as the minutes dragged on, the oppressive stillness began to weigh on him, heavier with each passing second. His muscles ached from staying in the same position for so long, hidden behind the shrubbery, watching with hawk-like intensity. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the rod tighter, the rough wood pressing into his palms. He glanced at the chicken coop. No movement, just the faint silhouette of the structure, shadowed by the looming trees behind it. Then he glanced toward the pond. It was barely visible through the thick mist, a still, stagnant pool of black water reflecting the dull sheen of moonlight. The pond had always given him an uneasy feeling, though he would never admit it out loud. There had been too many stories, too many whispered warnings about that place. The villagers said it was cursed, that something unnatural lurked beneath its surface. He had always dismissed such talk as nonsense, but now, couched in the silence of the night, those stories crept into his mind unbidden. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Fear was the thief's greatest ally, and Mr. Tao wasn't about to let it cloud his judgment. Whoever had been stealing his chickens was no spirit. He was sure of it. It had to be someone from the village, someone cunning enough to evade his traps and sneak past his dogs. Tonight he would catch them. He just had to be patient. But then the silence was broken. A faint noise drifted through the fog, barely audible at first. Mr. Tao froze, his body instantly alert, every nerve on edge. It was a low, scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the ground. He held his breath, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the direction of the pond. His pulse quickened, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly he turned his head toward the dark pool of water. The fog seemed to thicken around it, swirling in slow, deliberate circles, and the sound grew louder, a slow, rhythmic scrape, like the dragging of something wet and sodden through the mud. He narrowed his eyes, trying to pierce through the mist, but there was nothing, just the vague outline of the pond, shrouded in darkness. His mind raced. Could it be the thief? Were they hiding in the mist, using the pond as cover to sneak around? But that didn't make sense. Who would come from the pond? A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. The scraping sound continued, persistent, unrelenting. It wasn't the sound of footsteps, not the crunch of leaves or the snap of twigs underfoot. It was something else, something wrong. Another noise joined the scraping, a faint creak, like the groan of wood under pressure. Mr. Tao's heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. It was the creaking of a yoke, the kind used to carry heavy buckets of water or rice. But why would someone be carrying a yoke at this time of night? And more importantly, why would they be near the pond? His grip tightened on the rod, his muscles tensing. He peered through the mist, hoping for a glimpse of movement, but the fog was too thick. The sound, however, was unmistakable now. The slow, deliberate creak of a yoke, swaying with the weight of its load, growing louder as it neared the edge of the pond. Fear began to creep into Mr. Tao's mind, despite his efforts to push it away. This wasn't right. Something about the sounds didn't fit, didn't make sense. And the dogs, they should have been barking by now, alerting him to the presence of an intruder. But they were silent, unnaturally so. His breath quickened, his chest tightening as the cold air filled his lungs. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, thudding like a drum, each beat faster than the last. His instinct screamed at him to get up, to run back to the safety of his house, but he stayed frozen in place, unable to tear his gaze away from the pond. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. A flicker of movement. It was brief, barely more than a shadow shifting in the mist, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. His heart lurched and he blinked, focusing on the spot where he had seen the movement. The fog parted for a moment, revealing the still surface of the pond, dark and murky. But there was something else, something just beneath the surface. He squinted, trying to make out the shape. A pale, bloated hand broke the surface of the water. Mr. Tow's breath caught in his throat. The hand was discolored, swollen, the skin stretched tight over the bones, as though it had been submerged in the water for too long. It rose slowly, fingers played, grasping at the air, before sinking back into the water with a soft splash. He stifled a gasp, his chest tightening with fear. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of what he had just seen. Was it real? Or had his eyes played tricks on him in the fog? He rubbed his eyes, blinking hard, but when he looked back at the pond, it was still. The surface was undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. For a long moment he remained frozen, his body rigid with terror. The rational part of his mind screamed that it had to be his imagination, that there was no such thing as ghosts, no such thing as spirits rising from the dead. But the primal part of him, the part that had been listening to the stories of the pond his whole life, knew better. Something was there, something had moved. He took a shaky breath, his chest heaving. Every instinct told him to leave, to get out of there before whatever was in the pond decided to come after him. But he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his legs trembling, his hands slick with sweat. The scraping sound returned. This time it was closer, much closer. The sound grated against his nerves like nails on a chalkboard, and his whole body tensed. He scanned the fog, his eyes wide, searching for the source. There, through the mist, just at the edge of the pond, a figure. It was barely visible, a dark shape moving slowly through the fog, dragging something behind it. Mr. Tow's heart pounded, fear flooding his veins. The figure was hunched over, its shoulders bent, and in its hands it carried a yoke. The creaking sound grew louder as the figure drew nearer, the bucket swaying with each step, sloshing with a thick, wet sound. He couldn't see the figure's face, but he didn't need to. Every instinct screamed at him that this was not a living person. The air around the figure seemed colder, the fog thickening, swirling like tendrils around its form. And then it stopped. The figure stood motionless at the edge of the pond, the yoke still swaying on its shoulders, as though waiting. Mr. Tow's breath came in shallow gasps, his body shaking with fear. He couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. The figure raised its head slowly, turning toward him, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. A wave of cold terror washed over him. The face was pale, bloated, like something pulled from the depths of the pond after weeks of rotting. The eyes were empty, hollow, staring straight through him. And the smell, oh God, the smell like damp earth and decaying flesh, thick and suffocating, filled the air around him. Mr. Tow staggered back, his legs weak beneath him. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was trapped in a nightmare, and the figure, the thing, was watching him, waiting. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward. That was all it took. With a strangled cry, Mr. Tow turned and fled, his heart racing, his feet pounding against the ground as he tore through the garden. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He didn't need to see it again to know it was still there, watching him, following him. The scraping sound followed him all the way back to the house. Part 3. The Unseen Presence. The night seemed to stretch endlessly before Mr. Tow, the stillness around him pressing down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. His heart still pounded from the sounds he had heard earlier, the scraping, the creaking yoke, but now all was silent once again. Too silent. He felt trapped in a strange limbo, waiting for something he couldn't quite understand, yet knowing with every fiber of his being that it was coming. A strange sensation crept over him as he crouched in the garden, his back pressed against the rough bark of a tree. His eyes darted nervously between the chicken coop and the pond, which seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain. The fog still clung to the ground, dense and impenetrable, and the moon remained hidden behind thick clouds, casting only a dull, ghostly glow over the landscape. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Mr. Tao saw it a faint glimmer. His breath caught in his throat as he turned slowly toward the pond. At first he wasn't sure if his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he squinted through the mist, the light became clearer. It was a small, faint glow and eerie, greenish light rising from the surface of the pond. It hovered just above the water, pulsating gently, as if it were alive. The light floated upwards, cutting through the dense fog, and Mr. Tao could do nothing but stare, transfixed. His heart raced, fear gripping him, but his body refused to move. He watched breathless as the light moved slowly, deliberately, through the air like a willow, the wisp teasing him with its otherworldly presence. The greenish light floated higher, drifting toward a nearby tree. Its glow illuminated the branches, casting long, twisted shadows that stretched across the ground like clawed hands reaching out from the darkness. The light seemed to dance for a moment, flickering in and out of existence, before settling on one of the tree's gnarled branches. Mr. Tao's skin prickled as a cold shiver ran down his spine. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this some kind of spirit? An apparition? He had heard stories of ghostly lights that appeared around the pond, but he had never believed them until now. He blinked, hoping the light would disappear, that it was nothing more than an illusion caused by the fog and the eerie stillness of the night. But it remained glowing softly, as if watching him, waiting for something. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light blinked out of existence. The sudden darkness that followed was suffocating. It pressed down on Mr. Tao like a weight, and for a moment he could hear nothing but the frantic beating of his own heart. He waited, frozen in place, listening intently for any sound, any sign of movement, but the night was eerily still once more. Just when he thought it was over, the silence was shattered. A loud splash echoed through the night, breaking the oppressive quiet like a gunshot. The sound came from the pond, sharp, violent, and too deliberate to be natural. Mr. Tao's heart nearly stopped. His body jerked involuntarily, as if the sound had physically struck him. He forced himself to look toward the water, every nerve screaming at him to run, to get as far away as possible, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The surface of the pond, which had been still just moments ago, now rippled violently. Something had disturbed the water. The fog above the pond swirled, parting slightly to reveal the dark, murky depths below, but there was no sign of what had caused the splash. Mr. Tao's pulse quickened, his mouth dry with fear. He gripped the rod tighter in his hands, the rough wood biting into his palms, but it did nothing to calm the rising panic in his chest. Another splash, louder this time. The water churned as though something massive had just breached the surface. Mr. Tao's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest heaving with each one. He could feel the icy grip of fear tightening around his throat, squeezing the air from his lungs. He leaned forward, his eyes wide, scanning the pond for any sign of movement. The ripples spread outward, the edges glinting faintly in the dull moonlight. Then he saw it. At first it was nothing more than a shadow, barely visible through the mist that clung to the surface of the water. But as the shadow grew larger, taking form, Mr. Tao's stomach dropped. Something or someone was emerging from the pond. A shape began to rise slowly from the water, its silhouette vague and indistinct at first, but unmistakably human. The water clung to it, dripping from its form in thick, slow rivulets. As it emerged further, Mr. Tao's heart slammed against his ribs. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and its movements were deliberate, methodical, as though it were dragging itself from the very depths of the earth. The figure's head broke the surface, its face obscured by the fog and the dripping water, but even from a distance, Mr. Tao could see its skin pale and bloated, a sickly grey-green color that reminded him of something long dead. He bit down hard on his lip, a metallic taste flooding his mouth as the figure rose higher, water cascading from its body in thick sheets. It stood waist deep in the pond now, its chest heaving with slow, laborious breaths. Mr. Tao felt bile rise in his throat as the figure's arms lifted, the water sloshing around them as if in slow motion. Its fingers, long, spindly, and grotesquely thin, grasped the air, clawing at the fog as if it were searching for something or someone. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He wanted to turn away, to flee, but his legs refused to obey. It was as if some unseen force had rooted him to the ground, forcing him to bear witness to this grotesque spectacle. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body remained paralyzed, held captive by the horror unfolding before him. The figure took a step forward, its foot breaking the surface of the water with a sickening squelch. Mud and debris clung to its legs as it dragged itself toward the shore, the sound of wet, heavy footsteps echoing in the night. With each step, the figure's form became clearer, its features more defined and more horrifying. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a grotesque mask of decay. Hollow, sunken eyes stared out from beneath a tangle of wet, matted hair. The skin was stretched tight across its skull, the color of rotting flesh, and its mouth hung open in a gaping, unnatural grin, as though frozen in a silent scream. A foul stench filled the air, thick and overwhelming, the unmistakable odor of death and decay. Mr. Tao's stomach churned and he fought the urge to retch. The figure continued to advance, its movements slow but relentless, as though it were being drawn inexorably toward him. Every step it took sent a fresh wave of terror crashing through him, and yet he remained rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Suddenly the figure stopped. It stood at the edge of the pond, its feet sinking into the soft mud, the water lapping at its ankles. For a long moment it simply stood there, staring. Mr. Tao could feel its gaze on him, cold and empty, like the eyes of a corpse. The silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive, broken only by the sound of the water dripping from the figure's body. Then, without warning, the figure lifted its head, and its hollow eyes locked onto Mr. Tao's. His breath hitched in his throat. A cold, suffocating terror gripped him, more intense than anything he had ever felt before. Those eyes, those empty, soulless eyes seemed to bore into him, seen through his flesh, through his bones, straight to the very core of his being. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the figure could see every fear, every secret he had ever tried to bury. And then the figure smiled. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the corners of its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. The sight of that twisted grin sent a shock of pure, visceral terror through Mr. Tao, and finally his body responded. With a strangled gasp he turned and ran. His feet pounded against the ground, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The garden blurred around him as he sprinted toward the house, the fog swirling in his wake. He didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the figure behind him, could hear the wet squelch of its footsteps as it followed, relentless, unstoppable. His heart thundered in his chest, his lungs burning with the effort. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The house loomed ahead of him, a dark silhouette against the night sky, but it felt impossibly far away. Each step felt like an eternity, each second stretched to the breaking point by the sheer weight of his terror. Finally, he reached the door, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the handle. He threw it open and stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind him. For a moment he stood there, gasping for breath, his body shaking with adrenaline and fear. But the sound continued, that slow, wet squelch. Part 4. The ghost appears. Mr. Tao's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling as he clutched the door frame. The sensation of cold sweat trickled down his back, his fingers slick with moisture as he wiped them against his clothes in a futile attempt to steady himself. His heart pounded in his chest like a drumbeat, a wild rhythm that filled the suffocating silence of the night. He had run, he had fled from the garden, from the pond, but something had followed him. He could feel it. The air was heavy with an unseen presence, something far worse than the mere thief he had expected to catch. The sound of dripping water echoed through the still night, an eerie, rhythmic drip 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 that that set his teeth on edge. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, praying that this was all some terrible dream, a figment of his imagination born out of exhaustion and frustration. But deep down he knew it wasn't. Something had emerged from that pond. Something ancient and foul, dredged up from the dark depths where it had slumbered for who knows how long. Mr. Tao forced his eyes open, his pulse quickening as his gaze returned to the pond. The fog was thicker now, swirling in slow, languid motions across the water's surface. And then, like a nightmare coming to life, he saw it rising from the pond with a dreadful slowness, as though time itself was bending to accommodate its grotesque emergence. At first it was just a silhouette, a shadowy figure hunched low as it rose from the murky water. The sound of wet mud and water sloughing off its body filled the air, and Mr. Tao's breath caught in his throat. The figure was drenched, soaked from head to toe, with long, ragged strands of hair clinging to its sallow face like dark, slimy tendrils. Its body was covered in thick mud, which dripped from its limbs in long, oily streams, pooling at its feet as it stood knee-deep in the pond. But it was the hat that caught his attention first. A wide-brimmed, conical hat, weathered and torn in places, sat on the figure's head. The edges were frayed dark with age and decay, casting deep shadows over its face. Mr. Tao's stomach twisted in a knot of terror as the figure slowly straightened, revealing the full horror of its form. Slung across its shoulders was a yoke-long wooden beam with two large, rusted buckets hanging from either side. Water sloshed in the buckets, dripping down to the ground in steady, rhythmic drops. There was something deeply wrong about the way it moved, slow and deliberate, as though it was following some ancient, forgotten ritual. It took heavy, dragging steps, each one accompanied by the wet squelch of mud beneath its feet, moving with an unnatural grace that sent a chill through Mr. Tao's bones. The figure walked with its head slightly bent, as though weighed down by the yoke, its body swaying eerily from side to side as it moved closer to the chicken coop. A gasp escaped Mr. Tao's lips before he could stop it. He clamped a hand over his mouth, eyes wide, heart racing in his chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. The figure's movements were too strange, too slow, as though it were dragging itself from the depths of the earth. He could feel the presence of death clinging to it, a foul stench that seemed to radiate from its very being. The air around him grew thick and cold, the temperature dropping unnaturally fast, and his breath puffed out in small clouds of mist, despite it being a summer's night. As the figure came closer, Mr. Tao's mind screamed at him to flee, to run far, far away, but he couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, his muscles locked in place by sheer terror. He could only watch, helpless, as the ghostly figure lumbered closer, inching ever nearer to the chicken coop. The pale moonlight, obscured by thick clouds, cast a sickly glow over the scene, and that's when Mr. Tao saw the thing's face. Pale, decayed, rotting. Its skin was the color of ash, stretched tightly over the bones of its face. The flesh had started to peel away in some places, revealing patches of bone beneath, and its lips were drawn back in a grotesque green, exposing jagged, blackened teeth. Hollow, empty eye sockets stared out from beneath the brim of the hat, deep and dark like two endless pits of nothingness. And yet, somehow, even without eyes, it was looking straight at him. Mr. Tao's throat tightened, his stomach churning with revulsion. He had never seen anything like this, had never imagined something so horrifying could exist outside of his worst nightmares. The figure's head jerked slightly, its neck making a sickening cracking sound as it turned its gaze fully toward him. It wasn't moving fast, but it was moving with purpose. It was coming for him. He could feel it in the way the figure's steps grew more deliberate, more focused, as though drawn to his presence. The buckets hanging from the yoke swung back and forth with each step, the water sloshing over the edges, splattering onto the ground. It wasn't just pond water that dripped from those buckets. Mr. Tao squinted, his vision blurred with fear, and saw that the liquid spilling onto the earth was darker, thicker like blood. A fresh wave of terror swept over him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth was dry, his throat constricted with fear. All he could do was stare in horror as the figure reached the edge of the pond, stepping onto the soft earth with a squelch. It was getting closer. Closer. Every second the distance between them shrank, and Mr. Tao could feel the weight of the spirit's gaze bearing down on him, cold and suffocating. Then the figure stopped. It stood there, motionless, just a few feet away from the chicken coop. The buckets dangled from the yoke, the ropes creaking under their weight. For a long, agonizing moment, the spirit didn't move. It simply stood there, its head tilted slightly to one side, as though listening for something. Mr. Tao's heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing. What did it want? Why had it come here? The stories he had heard as a child rushed back to him, the tales of vengeful spirits, of lost souls who haunted the land, searching for something that had been taken from them. He had never believed those stories. But now, standing face to face with this abomination, he realized with a sinking dread that they were all true. The figure's head jerked suddenly, its neck cracking again as it turned away from Mr. Tao, its gaze shifting toward the chicken coop. For a brief, fleeting moment, Mr. Tao felt a surge of relief. Maybe it wasn't after him. Maybe it was here for something else, something inside the coop. The ghost took another step, its feet dragging through the mud, leaving deep impressions in the earth. Its skeletal hands reached out toward the coop, the fingers curling like claws as it grabbed the wooden door. The door creaked open slowly, the sound echoing in the still night air. Mr. Tao winced, his body tensing as the figure leaned forward, peering inside. Then, without warning, it turned its head again, looking straight at him. The grin on its decaying face widened, its teeth glinting in the faint moonlight. Mr. Tao's heart skipped a beat, his legs trembling beneath him. He wanted to run, but his body refused to move. He was trapped in a waking nightmare, his mind screaming for escape, while his body remained frozen in place. The spirit took another step toward him, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring his terror. The bucket swung with each step, and now Mr. Tao could see clearly what was inside them rotten. Decayed bones, covered in slick black mud. The smell of death filled the air, thick and overpowering, and Mr. Tao gagged, bile rising in his throat. As the spirit came closer, Mr. Tao's vision blurred with fear, his body trembling uncontrollably. He couldn't look away. He couldn't look away. He couldn't escape. The spirit was coming for him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The last thing he saw before the world went dark was the spirit's pale, rotting hand reaching out toward him, its fingers curling around his throat. Part 5. Confronting the Spirit. Mr. Tao's heart raced as the decaying figure drifted closer, its wide-brimmed hat casting a dark shadow over its face, obscuring the rotting features beneath. He could hear the wet squelch of the spirit's feet as they sank into the soft earth with each slow, deliberate step. The air around him thickened with a nauseating stench of foul, sickly odor that clung to his skin and filled his lungs, making it impossible to breathe without gagging. Terror gnawed at his insides, urging him to flee, but something deep inside fought against the overwhelming fear. He had lived through hard times, faced dangerous men, and survived countless challenges in his life. He would not be cowed by this spectre, this ghastly apparition. He clenched his jaw, wiping the sweat from his brow with trembling fingers, and tightened his grip on the wooden rod he had brought to catch the chicken thief. Now, it seemed utterly insignificant in the face of what he was about to confront. His eyes, wide with fear but burning with resolve, locked onto the spirit's form. Every step the figure took brought it closer to him, but its movements remained strangely detached, as if it were walking on a path only he could see. Its pallid, mud-caked form dragged through the garden, oblivious to the world of the living. The buckets hanging from the yoke swayed, dripping black, oily water onto the earth with every step. Mr. Tao's throat felt like sandpaper as he swallowed his fear. He raised the rod above his head, his muscles taut with tension. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape the presence of this ancient evil, but he stood his ground. His voice trembled as he finally shouted into the night, his words cutting through the suffocating silence like a blade. "Who are you? What do you want?" The sound of his own voice startled him. It felt small, weak, against the immense weight of the spirit's presence. But he forced himself to stay firm, planting his feet into the earth as though rooting himself to the ground. He raised the rod higher, brandishing it in front of him like a weapon. His pulse quickened, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he waited for the spirit's response. But it didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. The ghost continued its steady, methodical walk, its movements almost mechanical, as though it were following a path long forgotten. The hollow eyes, dark and empty beneath the brim of the hat, never once acknowledged Mr. Tao's presence. It was as though he were invisible, a mere shadow in the background of this otherworldly possession. The rod in his hand shook as Mr. Tao's anger flared, momentarily burning through the icy grip of fear. His shout had been ignored, dismissed, as if it didn't matter. That sense of insignificance sent a surge of frustration through him. This was his land, his home, and he refused to be cowed by whatever this thing was. Gritting his teeth, he took a step forward, his voice rising again, more forceful this time. "I said stop," he bellowed, his voice cracking at the edges. He swung the rod in front of him, the wood slicing through the air, its motion wild and desperate. But the spirit remained unfazed, its head tilting slightly, the empty eye sockets seeming to stare through him, as though peering into some distant, unknowable place. The figure moved with an eerie calm, its yoke creaking softly as it swayed back and forth on its shoulders, the buckets clattering together with a hollow, bone-chilling sound. Mr. Tao's heart sank. He could feel the fear crawling back, stronger now, suffocating him. The stench of rot grew unbearable, the air thick with decay. His stomach churned, bile rising in his throat as the spirit glided past him, its presence like a cold wind that numbed his skin and left his bones aching with dread. As it drew nearer, Mr. Tao found himself rooted to the spot, his limbs frozen with terror. He tried to lift the rod again, to move, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. It was as though the weight of the spirit's presence had locked him in place, his mind screaming for him to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible, but his legs were stone, his hands limp. The figure moved past him with slow, deliberate steps. Its body swayed unnervingly, the sound of wet fabric dragging through the dirt filling the night. As it passed Mr. Tao's nostrils were assaulted by the overpowering stench of death, an ancient, festering smell that clung to the ghost's form like a shroud. He gagged, his eyes watering as he fought the urge to vomit. For a brief moment, as the spirit passed by, its wide-brimmed hat dipped, revealing more of its decayed face. What remained of its skin was mottled and cracked, hanging loosely from the bones beneath. The jaw was slightly unhinged, its mouth hanging open in a grotesque mockery of life. Mr. Tao's stomach clenched, his fingers trembling as he watched in helpless horror. The spirit paid him no mind. It continued its march, slow and deliberate, its destination unknown. Mr. Tao could hear the faint slosh of water in the buckets as they swung from the yoke. With each step, the figure seemed to sink deeper into the darkness of the night, its form blending into the shadows that surrounded the garden. He wanted to scream, to shout after it, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. All he could do was watch as the figure moved further away, disappearing into the fog that clung to the trees beyond the garden. Its outline blurred as it melted into the mist, until all that remained was the faint echo of its dragging footsteps and the soft creak of the yoke, and then it was gone. The night swallowed the spirit whole, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. Mr. Tao stood there, alone in the darkness, his hand shaking uncontrollably as he lowered the rod to his side. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen, but there were no explanations, only fear, gnawing at his insides like a hungry beast. He felt cold, colder than he had ever felt before, the icy grip of terror still wrapped tightly around him. The garden, which had once been so familiar, now felt alien and hostile, as though something unseen still lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts as he backed away from the spot where the spirit had passed, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. His legs felt weak, barely able to support his weight, but he forced himself to move, to retreat back toward the safety of the house. Every step felt like a struggle, the weight of what he had witnessed pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. His mind replayed the image of the spirit's face over and over again, the hollow, empty eyes, the slack, rotting jaw, the foul stench of death that clung to it like a second skin. He could still smell it, taste it on his tongue, and it made him gag once more. By the time he reached the door to his home, he was barely holding himself together. His hand shook as he fumbled with the latch, his breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the spirit standing behind him, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. But the garden was empty. The pond was still. The spirit was gone, but for how long? As Mr. Tao stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind him, the only sound that echoed in the night was his own ragged breathing. He leaned against the wall, his eyes wide with terror, as the realization sank in. The spirit had not come for him tonight. But it had come for something or someone, and it would be back. Part 6. A Night of Fear. The door slammed shut behind Mr. Tao with a force that rattled the old wooden frame. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat sending a sharp, painful thud through his entire body. He locked the door with trembling hands, sliding the bolt into place with an audible click, as if that fragile piece of metal could somehow keep the horror he had just witnessed from creeping into his home. He pressed his back against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to calm his racing mind. The house was dark, the only light a faint glow from the moon filtering through the thin curtains of the windows. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe, like unseen creatures lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike. But it wasn't the shadows inside the house that terrified him, it was the thing outside. The thing that had risen from the pond. The decaying, mud-drenched figure with hollow eyes and a wide-brimmed hat, dragging buckets filled with something far worse than water. Mr. Tao squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the image, but it was no use. The spirit was burned into his mind, its ghastly face imprinted on the backs of his eyelids. He could still see those empty eye sockets that seemed to stare right through him, the slackened jaw, the grotesque grin that stretched across its decaying face. He could still smell the stench of raw, thick and overpowering, as though the air around him was still polluted by its presence. He stumbled across the room, his legs shaking beneath him, threatening to give out at any moment. His throat was dry, his mouth parched, and he swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising bile in his throat. He felt as though he might be sick, the nausea swirling in his stomach, as his mind replayed every horrific detail of the night. Reaching the small kitchen table, he collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His body trembled uncontrollably, his muscles still locked in the cold grip of fear. For a long time, he sat there, shivering in the silence of his home, trying to convince himself that what he had seen wasn't real. But he knew better. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows sent his nerves into a frenzy. He could feel it, the weight of something unseen pressing against the house, waiting just beyond the door. The spirit wasn't gone. He knew it wasn't. It had walked away, disappearing into the fog that clung to the trees beyond the garden, but that didn't mean it was finished. His heart sank as the full weight of that realization hit him. The spirit hadn't come for him tonight, but it would be back. Mr. Tao's hands curled into fists, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. What had he done to bring this horror upon himself? Was it the land, cursed by some ancient, forgotten grudge? Or was it something more personal, something buried deep within the history of his family, long before he ever came to this place? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more troubling than the last, but no answers came. All he knew was that the spirit's presence had awakened something dark and terrible, a force that had been waiting for its moment to return, and now it had found its way back into the world of the living. He glanced toward the window, the pale moonlight casting faint shadows across the floor. The night outside seemed impossibly still, the usual chorus of insects and nighttime creatures eerily absent. Even the wind had died down, leaving the world wrapped in a suffocating silence. But Mr. Tao could sense it, that lingering presence, like a thick, invisible fog that pressed against the walls of his home, seeping through every crack and crevice. The weight of it bore down on him, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. It was as though the spirit's very essence had clung to him, followed him into his house, and now it was watching, waiting for him to let his guard down. A shiver ran down his spine, and he instinctively pulled his chair closer to the table, as if the small piece of furniture could offer some protection. His eyes darted toward the door, the locked bolt standing between him and whatever lurked outside. For a moment he considered lighting a candle, just to chase away the darkness. But the thought of attracting attention, of drawing the spirit's gaze back to him, made his blood run cold. He didn't want to be seen. Not tonight. Instead, he sat in the semi-darkness, every muscle in his body tense, his ears straining for any sound. The house was old, and it groaned with every shift in the wind, but tonight, each creak felt deliberate, each settling floorboard like a whisper of something moving in the shadows. Time dragged on, the minutes ticking by in agonizing slowness. Mr. Tao's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling deeper into the darkness. What did the spirit want? Why had it appeared now, after so many years of peace? Was it simply a lost soul, wandering the earth in search of rest, or was there something more sinister at play? His mind wandered back to the stories he had heard as a child, tales of vengeful spirits, of restless souls who haunted the places of their deaths, seeking retribution for wrongs long forgotten. He had always dismissed them as superstition, the wild imaginations of villagers too steeped in folklore to know any better. But tonight, those stories didn't feel like mere myths. They felt real, terrifyingly real. The air in the house seemed to grow colder, the chill creeping in through the walls and settling into his bones. Mr. Tao wrapped his arms around himself, trying to stave off the icy feeling that had taken root inside him, but it was no use. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was inside him, as if the spirit had left a piece of itself behind, lodged deep in his soul. He closed his eyes, his body still trembling with fear. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, its gaze heavy and unrelenting. His skin prickled with unease, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. It was as though the spirit was still there, standing just outside the door, waiting for him to make a move. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to do something, anything to shake the growing sense of dread that gnawed at his insides. But he felt paralyzed, trapped in his own fear, unable to act. He had faced dangers before. He had dealt with thieves, with wild animals, with storms that threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. But this was different. There was no reasoning with the spirit. No bargaining, no pleading. It didn't care about money or possessions. It wanted something else, something far darker, and Mr. Tao had no idea what that was. The minutes dragged on, turning into hours. Sleep was impossible every time his eyes fluttered shut. The spirit's decaying face loomed in the darkness behind his eyelids. His mind was too wired, too alert, as if his very survival depended on staying awake, on keeping watch. But what could he do? How could he defend himself against something that wasn't even alive? The thought weighed heavily on him, pressing down like a stone on his chest. He had no answers, no plan. The spirit had come once, and it would come again, of that he was certain. And next time it might not be content to simply pass him by. The house creaked again, a sharp, sudden sound that made Mr. Tao jump in his chair. His eyes snapped open, his breath catching in his throat as he listened, his heart hammering in his chest. There was a thump of faint, distant sound, like something heavy hitting the ground. He held his breath, straining to hear more, but the silence returned just as quickly. His pulse raced, his mind grasping for an explanation, but none came. He was alone, trapped in the night, with only the memories of the ghost to keep him company. The spirit hadn't come for him tonight, but its presence lingered, thick and oppressive, like a storm gathering on the horizon. and Mr. Tao knew, deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning. The haunting had just begun. Part 7. The village elder's warning. The first rays of sunlight had barely pierced through the heavy mist hanging over the village when Mr. Tao hurried through the narrow streets, his heart pounding as the chilling events of the previous night replayed in his mind. His legs felt weak beneath him, and every step seemed to drag him deeper into a growing sense of dread. He had not slept a wink. How could he? The haunting image of the ghostly figure rising from the pond, dripping with death, haunted him at every turn. His hands still trembled from the memory, but fear alone wasn't enough to keep him in his house. He needed answers. The spirit had not come to simply scare him, it was after something. It had unfinished business and Mr. Tao feared that he would not stop until it had claimed whatever it sought. He arrived at the elders' meeting hall, a small, weathered building at the edge of the village that seemed to sag under the weight of centuries of history. The air around it felt thick and oppressive, as though the very land carried the weight of forgotten stories, of unspeakable secrets buried deep in the soil. The village elders were the keepers of those stories, and if anyone knew how to stop this nightmare, it was them. Mr. Tao hesitated at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. His mouth felt dry, his palms slick with sweat. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and pushed open the creaking wooden door. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a few small windows, their glass clouded with age. The smell of incense hung in the air, mixing with the musty scent of old wood. 3 of the village elders sat around a low table, their faces lined with age and wisdom, their expressions serious. They were known throughout the village for their knowledge of the old ways, for their understanding of the forces that moved unseen in the world. As Mr. Tao entered, they looked up, their eyes dark and inscrutable. The weight of their gaze made his stomach churn, but he forced himself to speak. I've seen something, he stammered, his voice shaky. Something from the pond. A spirit. It came last night. For a moment there was silence. The elders exchanged glances, their faces grave, as if his words had confirmed their darkest suspicions. One of the elders, the oldest among them, leaned forward slightly. His voice was low and raspy, like the rustle of dead leaves in the wind. "You saw it," the elder said, his tone more a statement than a question. Mr. Tao nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, it came from the water. It was carrying something, 2 buckets, and it was rotting, the elder finished, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. Mr. Tao's breath caught in his throat. Yes, he whispered. How did we know? The second elder interrupted, her voice tinged with a sadness that sent chills down Mr. Tao's spine. We have always known. The third elder, a woman with sharp, piercing eyes, leaned closer, her gaze never leaving Mr. Tao's face. The pond is cursed, he said, her voice almost a whisper. It has been for many years, but no one speaks of it anymore. Most have forgotten. But the curse remains, as strong as it was the day it was cast. A chill ran down Mr. Tao's spine. Curse, he asked, his voice trembling. Why? What happened? The elders exchanged another glance, their expressions darkening further. It was the eldest among them who spoke again, his voice heavy with the weight of the past. Many years ago, long before you or I were born, there was a man who lived in this village. The elder began, his voice slow and deliberate, as though every word carried a terrible burden. He was a simple man, a farmer like so many of us. But he was betrayed. Someone close to him, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a friend, took advantage of his trust. They lured him to the pond under the guise of friendship, and there they drowned him. Mr. Tao felt his stomach twist with horror. The words hit him like a physical blow, the image of the ghostly figure rising from the water now taking on a far darker meaning. The elder continued, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing the events unfold in his mind. The man's body was never found. It sank to the bottom of the pond, where it remains to this day. His spirit, however, did not rest. He was filled with rage, with hatred for those who had wronged him. And so his spirit lingered, trapped in the water, bound to the place of his death. But why now, Mr. Tao asked, his voice tight with fear. Why has the spirit returned after all this time? The second elder, her voice low and sorrowful, answer. Spirits like his do not move freely. They are tied to the land, to the water, and to the act of their death. For many years he has been silent, waiting. But something must have disturbed him. Something, perhaps someone has stirred the curse. Awakening the rage that has lain dormant all these years, Mr. Tao's heart raced as he thought back to the recent changes in the village, to his own work on the land surrounding the pond. Could he have been the one to disturb the spirit? Was this his fault? I've done nothing wrong, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've only worked the land. It is not a question of guilt, the third elder said sharply, her eyes narrowing. You may not have wronged him, but that does not matter. The spirit's rage is blind. He seeks vengeance, and anyone who crosses his path will suffer. He does not care who you are. He only cares about settling the score. Mr. Tao's blood ran cold. The spirit wasn't just haunting him, it was hunting him. And there was no way to reason with it, no way to explain that he had no part in the betrayal that had led to its death. What can I do? He asked, his voice shaking. How do I stop it? The elders were silent for a long moment, their faces grave. Finally, the eldest among them spoke again. There is no easy way to stop a spirit like this, he said, his voice heavy with regret. Once it has been awakened, it will not rest until its thirst for vengeance has been quenched. You cannot fight it with strength, nor can you plead with it for mercy. The only way to rid yourself of this curse is to return to the pond, to face the spirit in the place where it was wronged. And to make amends for the sins of the past, make amends, Mr. Tao asked, his heart pounding. How? How can I make amends for something that happened so long ago? The eldest elder's eyes bore into his, and his voice was grave as he spoke. You must return what was taken. The man's spirit remains restless because something was stolen from him in life, something more than just his breath. It may be his honor, his dignity, or something far worse. You must go to the pond and offer it back. Only then will the spirit find peace. Mr. Tao felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know what had been taken, didn't know how he could possibly return something that had been lost for so long. But the look in the elder's eyes told him that this was his only hope. And if I fail? Mr. Tao asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The elder's silence was answer enough. If he failed, the curse would claim him, just as it had claimed the man who had drowned so many years ago. Go, the eldest elder said softly. Return to the pond tonight, but be warned, the spirit is powerful and its rage is great. Tread carefully, Mr. Tao, for once you step into that place, you may not return. Mr. Tao's heart sank. The weight of what he had to do settled over him like a shroud, suffocating in its intensity. He stood from the table, his legs trembling beneath him, and bowed to the elders before making his way toward the door. As he stepped outside, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the village. But despite the warmth of the morning, Mr. Tao felt only cold. The spirit was waiting for him, and tonight he would have to face it alone. Part 8. The spirit's revenge? The village elder's words echoed in Mr. Tao's mind long after he left their presence. Every step he took toward his home felt heavier, his legs dragging, as if the weight of the spirit's curse had wrapped itself around him, pulling him deeper into the abyss of terror that now consumed his every thought. The spirit is free. It will not rest until justice is served. The elder's grim voices haunted him, as relentless as the spirit itself. There was no escaping it. Mr. Tao knew, deep in his bones, that he had no control over what was coming for him. No walls, no locks, no prayers could keep it at bay. It was as if the spirit had awakened from its long slumber, unleashed from the pond where it had waited in silence for countless years. Now, it had found its target, him. His hands trembled as he pushed open the door to his house, the familiar creak of the hinges offering no comfort. Inside, the air felt thick, oppressive, as though the spirit's presence had seeped into every corner of his home, watching him from the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. He stumbled to the table, sinking into a chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart pounded in his chest, the beat of it wild and frantic, as if it too sensed the doom that was closing in around him. He felt powerless, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The spirit wanted justice, but what justice? What had he done to deserve this torment? The elders had spoken of betrayal, of a drowning long ago, but Mr. Tao had no part in that tragedy. He was an innocent man, caught in the storm of an ancient curse that had nothing to do with him, and yet the spirit had chosen him, had risen from the depths of the pond to claim him. "Why me?" he whispered into the empty room, his voice trembling with fear and confusion. "I've done nothing," but the silence that followed his words was suffocating, as though the spirit was mocking his desperation. The room around him felt smaller, the walls closing in, the air growing colder. It was as if the house itself had become a prison, and there was no escape. His mind raced, scrambling for a solution, but every thought led to the same dead end. There was no escaping the spirit's wrath. The elders had made that clear. Once awakened, the spirit would not stop until it had what it wanted. It would hunt him relentlessly until its thirst for vengeance was sated. And what could he do to stop it? He was no match for a force that had risen from beyond the grave. The spirit was no longer bound to the pond. It was free now, free to move wherever it wished, free to strike whenever it chose. The realization hit him like a blow, sending a wave of cold dread crashing over him. "It will come for me again." The thought echoed in his mind, growing louder, more insistent, until it drowned out everything else. The spirit would come again tonight or tomorrow or the night after, but it would come. And when it did, there would be no stopping it. Mr. Tao's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into the wood of the table. His throat tightened, his mouth dry with terror. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear the rush of blood in his ears. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to slow, each second stretching out into an eternity as the weight of his impending doom pressed down on him. He could almost hear the faint sound of the pond, the water lapping gently against the shore, its surface hiding the horrors beneath. He could see the figure in his mind, rising slowly from the dark water, its pale, decaying face staring at him with hollow, unseeing eyes. The bucket swinging from its yoke, dripping with death. The spirit was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He stood abruptly, knocking the chair over as he stumbled away from the table. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths as he paced the room, his eyes darting to the door, to the windows, searching for any sign of the spirit's approach. But the room remained still, the only sound the ticking of the clock, each tick like a heartbeat counting down the moments until the spirit returned. Mr. Tao stopped in front of the window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered outside. The sun was sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The pond, barely visible in the distance, seemed to shimmer with a dark, malevolent energy, as if the water itself was alive, waiting for nightfall to bring forth the spirit once more. He felt his stomach twist with fear. Night was coming, and with it the spirit. He turned away from the window, his mind racing, trying to think of a way to protect himself. He could leave, run far away from the village, from the pond, from the curse. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was futile. The spirit wasn't bound to the pond anymore. It had followed him once, and it would follow him again. No matter where he went, it would find him. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the floor, his body shaking with fear. Tears welled in his eyes, his breath coming in desperate gasps, as the full weight of his situation crashed over him. He was going to die. The spirit was going to kill him. A sob escaped his throat, and he buried his face in his hands, his body trembling with terror and hopelessness. He had no weapons, no power against a force like this. The spirit was beyond anything he could fight. It was old, filled with rage and grief and hatred that had simmered for decades, maybe even centuries. And now all of that rage was focused on him. The room seemed to grow colder. the shadows deepening as the last light of the day faded from the sky. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of dread that wrapped itself around Mr. Tao like a suffocating blanket. Night was falling, and with it, the spirit would rise again. A soft, distant sound reached his ears, like the faintest ripple of water. His heart stopped, his body frozen in place as he listened. It was the sound of the pond. The water was stirring. Mr. Tao's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted toward the window, but he was too terrified to move, too terrified to look outside and confirm what he already knew. It was coming. The sound grew louder, a slow, rhythmic lapping of water, as if something was moving beneath the surface, rising once more to claim what it had been denied. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though the very air around him was alive with the spirit's presence. Mr. Tao's chest tightened, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His skin prickled with fear, his mind racing with thoughts of what would happen when the spirit arrived. He imagined it pushing open the door, its decaying face leering at him, its bony fingers reaching out to drag him down into the depths of the pond, where he would join the countless others who had met their fate at its hands. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. The walls of the house seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. He could feel the spirit's approach, like a cold wind that seeped through the cracks in the walls, chilling him to the bone. It was coming. It was almost here. He stumbled to his feet, his legs weak and trembling beneath him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could protect him. But there was nothing. No weapon, no charm, no spell that could stop what was already in motion. The sound of water grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be just outside the door. Mr. Tao's heart raced, his hands shaking as he backed away, his eyes locked on the door, as though expecting it to burst open at any moment. The spirit was here. It had come for him. A low, eerie creak echoed through the house, and Mr. Tao's breath caught in his throat. The door, his only barrier against the spirit, was shifting. The ancient wood groaned under the weight of the invisible force pressing against it, the sound sending a jolt of terror through Mr. Tao's body. He stumbled backward, his legs nearly giving out as he collided with the wall behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling uncontrollably as he stared at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for the spirit to claim him. But the door didn't open, not yet. Instead, a soft, whispering voice filled the room, barely audible but thick with menace. "You cannot escape me." Mr. Tao's blood ran cold. His heart thundered in his chest as the voice seemed to wrap around him, suffocating him with its presence. The spirit wasn't just outside, it was inside. It had already found him. "You cannot escape me," the voice echoed in his mind, louder now, more insistent, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. And then, in the silence that followed, came the sound of water dripping slow, deliberate drops hitting the floor with a hollow, echoing sound. Drip, drip, drip. It was here. Part 9. The Return of the Ghost. As dusk began to settle over the village, the air thickened with a foreboding tension. The sky, once tinged with the soft colors of sunset, now grew darker, bleeding into shades of inky black and deep violet. Mr. Tao stood motionless at his window, staring out into the encroaching night, every fiber of his being strung tight with dread. His hands gripped the windowsill so hard that his knuckles turned white, but the fear coursing through him kept him rooted in place. He could see the pond in the distance, its surface eerily calm, reflecting the pale light of the rising moon. But that calm was a lie, Mr. Tao knew it was only a matter of time before the stillness was broken, before the ghost would rise again from its watery grave, drawn back by the curse, by the unfinished business it had in this world. His breath was shallow, almost too quiet, as if any sudden sound or movement might summon the ghost sooner. He had spent the entire day in a state of nervous anticipation, his mind consumed by the thought of what was to come. The elder's words rang endlessly in his head. The spirit is free. It will not rest until it finds justice done. Justice, Mr. Tao thought bitterly. What justice could be found in death? What justice could come from a life snuffed out, from a soul twisted by rage and betrayal? Whatever justice his spirit sought, it would not be satisfied until it claimed him as its final victim. The night grew darker, the stars appearing one by one in the sky, cold and indifferent to the horror unfolding below. The faint croak of frogs echoed in the distance, but the usual symphony of the night, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets was muted, as if the very land itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Mr. Tao swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel it now, an almost tangible pressure in the air, like the weight of unseen eyes watching his every move. The spirit was near. It was lurking just beyond the edge of the pond, waiting for night to fully descend before it came for him. With a trembling hand, Mr. Tao wiped the sweat from his brow, though the night air was cool. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythmic thudding deafening in the silence. He backed away from the window, the weight of his fear pressing down on him with every step. There was no escape, no refuge from the nightmare that was about to unfold. He was trapped, a prisoner of fate, and he knew it. The pond. It always began with the pond. His eyes flicked to the door, but there was no point in running. The spirit had found him once before it would find him again, no matter where he went. His hands twitched by his sides, a primal instinct urging him to flee, to escape the suffocating sense of doom that hung over him. But deep down, he knew there was no outrunning death. He sank into a chair, his body slumped as if the weight of the impending confrontation had drained him of all strength. His pulse raced, his mind spiraling into a whirlpool of fear and desperation. Memories of the previous night flooded back of the figure rising from the pond, of its pale, decaying face and the buckets dripping with murky water. He could almost smell the stench of rot, of something ancient and foul clawing its way back to the surface. A low, faint ripple of sound caught his attention, and his blood ran cold. The pond. He could hear it even from this distance, the unmistakable sound of water stirring, of something breaking the surface. Slowly, mechanically, as if in a trance, Mr. Tao rose from his seat and moved back to the window. His body moved, but his mind screamed at him to stop, to hide, to pretend that if he couldn't see the ghost, it wouldn't come for him. But it was already too late. The surface of the pond rippled under the silver glow of the moon, disturbed by a presence that should not be there. The water, once still, now churned as though something immense and terrible lurked beneath, waiting to emerge. Mr. Tao's breath caught in his throat as he stared wide-eyed, unable to tear his gaze away. Then it happened. The water bulged as though pushed upward by an unseen force, and from the depths a figure began to rise. Mr. Tao's body stiffened with fear, his heart hammering wildly in his chest. The ghost was back. The figure broke through the surface of the water, slow and deliberate, the same haunting silhouette that had haunted his nightmares. Its wide-brimmed hat dripped with pond water, the yoke across its shoulders weighed down by the heavy, sloshing buckets. The spirit's face, pale and bloated, turned towards him, though its eyes remained hollow, vacant, as if it could not truly see him, but it knew he was there. Its appearance hadn't changed. The ghost still looked like a man who had been submerged for far too long, his skin bloated and slick with the pond's grime, his movements slow and deliberate, as though it dragged the weight of death with every step. Mr. Tao's legs trembled violently beneath him, his body betraying him. He backed away from the window, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the oppressive atmosphere thickened, making it hard to breathe. His skin prickled as an invisible force pressed against him, almost as though the ghost's cold, damp fingers were already reaching for him. He clutched the edge of a chair for support, his knuckles white as he watched the figure approach the edge of the pond. It moved with an agonizing slowness, as though savoring the moment, as though it knew Mr. Tao's terror was growing with each passing second. A loud splash broke the silence as the spirit stepped onto the bank, dragging its soaked form onto the grass. The once serene garden now felt twisted, perverted by the presence of the ghost. The moonlight that had bathed the garden in a soft glow now seemed harsh, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with each movement of the ghost. Mr. Tao's mind screamed at him to do something, anything, but his body remained frozen in place. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He was paralyzed by the knowledge that this was the end. The spirit had come for him, and there was no escape. The ghost's footsteps squelched against the wet grass as it continued its slow, deliberate march towards the house. The bucket swung from the yoke with each step, water spilling out in murky, fetid droplets that stained the ground. Mr. Tao could feel his pulse in his ears, his chest tightening as panic gripped him fully. In that moment, the world around him seemed to fall away. The room shrank, the walls pressing in on him as the weight of his fate crashed down like a tidal wave. There was no bargaining with the spirit, no reasoning with it. The wrongs of the past were too deep, too ancient. He was merely the final thread in a tapestry woven with betrayal and death. The ghost reached the edge of the garden, its eyes, or what was left of them, still fixed in Mr. Tao's direction. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees, his hands shaking violently as he gripped the floor, his eyes wide and filled with tears. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't. The spirit's revenge was inevitable. Outside, the pond felt eerie still once again, its surface mirroring the moon's pale light. The ripple had settled. The water was silent. The ghost stood at the doorway now, a looming figure that seemed impossibly tall, casting a long shadow that stretched across the floor, its presence filling the house with an overwhelming sense of death. It did not speak. It did not need to. In the quiet that followed, Mr. Tao realized the chilling truth. There would be no mercy. There would be no escape. The spirit had returned to claim what had been taken from it long ago. Vengeance. With a final breath, Mr. Tao closed his eyes, his body trembling uncontrollably. He could feel the cold, wet presence of the ghost, feel its icy breath as it drew closer, closer still. The night closed in around him, the air growing impossibly cold until there was nothing left but the suffocating darkness. The last sound he heard was a drip of water on the floor, slow and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock counting down the moments of his life. Drip, 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 and then silence.